Okay, so we have Dr. Tim Prather joining us from Idaho. He's a professor at the University of Idaho in the Department of Plant Sciences. He conducts research and extension on invasive plant species, biology, and management in range and forest plant systems. He also serves as the Senior Associate Director for the University of Idaho Rangeland Center. Within his extension program, he administers the University of Idaho weed diagnostic lab that identifies plants statewide, which is pretty cool. You can send in a plant sample and have someone tell you what it is, hopefully. And he's also the author of Idaho's Noxious Weeds. And I don't know if I actually ever met Tim in person, but when I previously worked at Montana State University with Jane Mangold, and he was an advisor for a graduate student in that lab I was in. So I'm happy that we got to invite Tim to speak today, and he'll be speaking to us about our favorite invasive annual grasses, management, and disturbance. All right, I think you can take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting me. And Stacy, yes, we've only met on the printed page and through email, so so it's good to be able to interact with you and with the other folks. So I've been asked if I would just talk a little bit about both disturbance and invasive annual grasses. And so what I thought I'd do is just go with a little bit of background before I get into everything else. And when we take a look at invasive species, you've got, it can be represented like we have here with this chart. So you've got this spread of invasive species here, and we've got our human society impacts affecting that, of course. And one of the things that we want to look at and focus on for today is there's a number of ways in which the invasive species have impacts. They can impact biotic natural cycles and abiotic factors, but one of the things is looking at that disturbance regime. So when we take a look at a number of the invasive plant species that we deal with, and in particular with the annual grasses, they're going to alter the fire frequency and intensity, and that can have other cascading effects. It can increase soil erosion. There can be other changes that take place. We can have carbon dioxide, of course, given off. So it's all sorts of things with the annual grasses. With some of our other species, we have other impacts as well. And I'll show you just a brief amount of that here in a minute. But one of the things I wanted to mention is this is a picture of course, of Idaho, but it translates also throughout the Pacific Northwest. And that's when we have what we call so-called Mediterranean climates, where we have dry summers. It's really interesting to take a look at the native flora. And so if you were to consider a continental climate, and you look at the number of annual species that are native in those systems, it's about 3% of annuals. When we go to our Mediterranean climates, it's 7 to 15% annual species. And in California, it's even higher, it's up to 30%. So there's something that within our system that allows for annuals to establish. And so one of the questions we have is, are we just naturally more susceptible to invasion in our system? And it's quite possible that we are, just given the propensity for us to have higher percentages of annuals in our native systems. When we look at these invasive species, we can think about them in a number of ways. One of them is this old traditional one of looking at R and K selected. You know, this is a population formula where you've got a carrying capacity and a rate of increase, and typically those species that favor the rate of increase are going to be short-lived, usually are annuals. They're early successional species, and then the Ks are longer lived, and they have a longer vegetative state, and those can be divided into ones that are competitive and also stress tolerant. And so something like this one right here, which is salt cedar, would be a stress tolerant species that can handle high salt and actually exude salt and creates that. And a good example of a R strategy is Russian thistle. And so when we look at where we find weeds along that, we really find them across that spectrum. Another way to look at it is that this would be familiar to some people, more familiar from a soils perspective on texture, but it's been adapted for looking at weed species as well. So you can have, this is right here, this is an index for stress tolerance. So you'd have stress increasing on this axis here. Here's competition, so competition increases here. And then disturbance is increasing along this axis. So you can see that high disturbance may indicate low stress. So what we're going to find is that our low stress, high disturbance species like our annual grasses are going to tend to be found here, whereas some of our other weedy species may be found either in the center or along this competitive continuum as well. So that's just a way to visualize looking at disturbance, competition, and stress all together. And so the grasses that we'll be talking about, according to this particular graph, fit more along this line right here on disturbance. And those effects, though, once that disturbance has occurred, can be pretty dramatic. And this is one, Stacy, this is out of Montana State. You might recognize this little emblem down here. But if we take a look at Bromus tectorum or cheatgrass, and we look at native species richness, it's going to decline as the cover of cheatgrass increases. And that's also reflected in diversity indices as well. We see a similar pattern when we take a look at ventinata. If we were to look at ventinata from a no ventinata to a high cover, and when we say high here, we're just talking about over 11% foliar cover. And so we can see that our species richness declines, and that's for all species. But if you just look at the natives, we see the same sort of thing, a decline in native species. Not much of an effect on non-native species at that early stage of invasion in sage, and this is within sage steppe. We've done a similar project for our canyon grasslands as well. But in addition to those competitive interactions, there can be other things that come into play. And so this is some work that we're trying to get funded for right now between U of I, Montana State, and University of Wyoming. And this, I've been working at University of Idaho for 23 years, and I've become very effective at presenting bad news. So I'll just continue that process. And so here what we're looking at is this is a soil feedback study where we looked at the soil sources underneath ventinata. And when we take a look at the mean biomass of plant species, this would be soil as collected, and this would be autoclaved. So what you can see is when it's autoclaved, here's cheatgrass, Idaho fescue, blue bunch, sandbrook bluegrass, blue bunch wheatgrass, and ventinata. And when you take a look at in the not autoclaved, as it was collected, you can see that all species are reduced, but you'll notice that ventinata is still doing much better, and it does better than all the others. So we're thinking that there's something going on in the soil, and you can see that here, and this is not as dramatic as autoclaving. This is pasteurized and unpasteurized. And this is blue bunch wheatgrass versus ventinata. And we're seeing that in the unpasteurized, you're seeing a reduction, and these are basically equivalent. There's no statistical difference between ventinata when it was unpasteurized versus pasteurized, but there was a decrease in blue bunch wheatgrass. So that's telling us that there's something going on in the soil that may have longer term effects than just competition. What I wanted to do is just spend a minute talking about some of the different annual grasses that we have and where they're from and what some of the ramifications are. So when we take a look at cheatgrass, you can see that in terms of its native range, it would include our Mediterranean climate, but it also includes a continental climate. And there's a pretty large difference between a northern latitude and a southern latitude. And so what that tells us is that it's adapted to a wide range of different types of plant communities. Field brome or Japanese brome, there's some, I don't know if it's controversy, but there's some question about whether or not Bromus arvensis and Bromus japonicus are the same species or not. They have different breeding responses, but we'll let that get sorted out by somebody else. But it has a very broad home range. It includes North Africa and spans quite a ways across Europe and Asia. And then poverty brome, Bromus sterilis, much more defined range, much more of just a Mediterranean climate. Red brome, again, a little bit more restricted in its range. Medusa head, these are all our favorites, and that spans a very wide range of habitats. And then ventinata, it goes across continental and Mediterranean climates. So what you can see is that all of these annual grass species basically grew up in the same neighborhood, and so they seem to be well adapted to the same types of climates across the board. Some of them have a little broader, and some are narrower in their ability to handle different climate regimes. If we take a look at a moisture gradient with these, we go from poverty brome, field brome, cheatgrass, red brome. We're going from wet to dry. And then we take a look at Medusa head, it overlaps here, and ventinata overlaps all of these except for red brome. So basically we have an annual grass for pretty much every situation. So one of the areas that I've been working on recently is in the sage steppe, and so we're looking at resilience. And if you look at low resilience, is in this Wyoming big sage, and as you get higher moisture, you get into more resilient. So they'll return back to their native state after disturbance more likely than these will, and we've been seeing that play out throughout our sagebrush steppe grasslands. If we take a look at some of the ones that are the main competitors, you've got a lot of area that's been dominated by these species. And because of that, we need to address that risk. And we have to do that at a scale that's relevant for the annual grass problem. And so we have to look at tactics for control. One of the ways that we've been doing that is our annual grass research has been at Rinker Rock Creek Ranch, which is in central Idaho, and it's in the mountain big sage, so it's in one of our more resilient systems. We looked at a broad scale study where we looked at both helicopter and aircraft, and we had Rejuvera and Plateau at 5 ounces each, and then we had different carrier rates that were sprayed. The reason for that is that Rejuvera is not very mobile in soil, and so if there's a lot of distance between droplets, you can actually have some of the plants escape control. And so we wanted to take a look at that. So we did the study according to this, but we need to actually look at it a little differently. We need to look at it in terms of percent of the ground that's actually covered with droplets. But this is just to show you our field site where we had made our applications. And these are 30 feet by 100 foot swaths. The ground was that way. The helicopter and airplane are 750 feet long. This is the way we actually expressed our results. This is a 4% coverage on a little spray card, and this is 18% coverage. So we had those spray cards along the flight paths. And then we analyzed our data based on that percent coverage. And this is really important for people that are looking at trying to write contracts for aerial application. However they can get the droplet coverage, if they can get better than a 5% droplet coverage. What you can see here is that in that first year, you have a lot of variability in control, from 100% control for some of them down to almost nothing. And what we find is that we have better odds of having good control if we have at least 7% herbicide droplet coverage for the Rejuva herbicide. If we combine Rejuva and Plateau, it's not as important. When we take a look at foliar cover, when we didn't have any treatment at all, we had about 24% in one of our drier years of annual grasses. And you can see that, that we had good control with both Rejuva and Rejuva plus Plateau. And this is 1 and 2 years after application we were seeing. This is the second year after application we saw this, and as we've continued that, we continued to see good control out to 3 years. We were concerned about what happened with our forbs, and so these are some of the forbs that were on our site. What we found was that for perennial forb cover, we didn't have any differences. Untreated perennial forb cover was 42%, treated forb cover was 48%, but those weren't statistically different. Where we did treat, we had 47 unique species. Where we didn't treat, we had 35. So it looks like we're not impacting our native forbs appreciably. I think in the first year we see somewhat of a decline, but by year 2 and 3, we're seeing forbs coming back into the site. Or not forbs coming back into the site, but recruitment of forbs at the site. So we can do a good job of annual grass control, and we can maintain diversity. Removal of those annual grasses then helps to address risk from fire. And just wanted to mention a study as a graduate student that she's no longer a graduate student. She graduated and she's off on a postdoc right now down at Tornado. But we looked at cheatgrass and then 2 bunch grasses, Columbia needlegrass and blue bunch wheatgrass. And we looked at hydrating those plants to different levels, 5 to 55%, and then perennials were hydrated along this schedule. And so we were looking at flammability of these. And the reason for looking at this is that we want to assess the fire risk in these sagebrush steppe grasslands. And so flammability was just a sum of a number of different factors. And I'll just be highlighting a couple of these. So the way we did this, there's a burn lab at the University of Idaho, and we constructed this stovepipe. We have a volume that we collect in, we put in this tube so that we can keep all the plants upright. You can see that they're upright here, and then we put that tube inside the stovepipe, open it up, and pull that out, insert some thermocouples, and then we ignite it. And I'll just show you one example of that. So this is cheatgrass at 10% fuel moisture, and we ignite it from a second room that we're looking at the stovepipe through a glass window, and you can see that it's ignited. And then what we were able to do is to measure the temperatures at these 3 different levels, and then we have the ability then to look to see how high the flame length is. And you can see it was over 140 centimeters in that case. So that's the funnest part of my talk for today. But when we take a look at this overall, what we find is that when you look at maximum temperature, as you go from, with cheatgrass, as you go from low fuel moisture to high fuel moisture, you can see that the temperatures decline. And that's true for needlegrass and blue bunch wheatgrass. That occurs all the way across. Combustibility, the same sort of thing. So we see a decline as we go. But when we take a look at adding cheatgrass, how does that impact the perennial grass flammability? So if we look at flame length, this is flame length without any cheatgrass, and now we're adding in cheatgrass in with the perennials, in this case with needlegrass. And you can see that as we add cheatgrass, we get a higher flame length, and that these two are statistically higher than this one at this 10 and 15. Maximum temperature was about the same, and thermal doses was about the same. Again, here, what we see is with blue bunch wheatgrass that statistically this was different at the 10 grams. So there's a little difference in when this takes, when we see cheatgrass flammability, we're starting to see some of that taking place when we get that 10 to 15 grams. When we look at this from a combined flammability standpoint of needlegrass, what we find is that if you look at each of these species individually, do they behave differently than if they are combined? And what we find with the needlegrass, and this is with 55% fuel moisture for the perennial, we find that there is an interaction, and combined we have greater consumption than we would if we didn't have the annual grass there. So we're seeing that needlegrass is more affected. And if you look at annual grass biomass here, you can see again that there's an effect size all the way across. When we take a look at that with blue bunch wheatgrass, what we find is that that does not occur. So effect size, there's no effect here on consumption, no effect on maximum temperature. Duration, when we get to 10 grams, now the duration, we're seeing an impact. So it looks like at lower annual grass biomass, when we're at 2.5 to 5 grams, we don't have that effect, but when it gets higher than that, then we start to see blue bunch wheatgrass being affected more when it has the cheatgrass with it. So what that's telling us then is that our cheatgrass, it does ignite and it burns across a wide range of fuel moisture. What we found was that cheatgrass would ignite across a whole range. Even though there wasn't as much flame length, it still ignited. Our fire risk from cheatgrass extends earlier into the season than what we had previously thought. So what I was hoping is that we would be able to define what that risk from fire is during the season, and that we would be able to say, here we're not, at this part of the season, we're not at risk of fire, but I think that that's going to be a much broader time span than what I had previously hoped. And the other interesting thing is that perennial grasses differ in flammability when cheatgrass is present. So some of our grasses at low amounts of cheatgrass are going to be just as flammable, like the Columbia needlegrass. But with blue bunch wheatgrass, if there's a low amount of cheatgrass, it doesn't look like we're going to have as big of a fire problem. So, and when we get to about 10 grams of cheatgrass, it's hard to equate that exactly to foliar cover, but in our circumstance, that was about anywhere from 10 to 15% foliar cover on the ground. So not a whole lot of cheatgrass was required in order to ignite those perennials. And so that's what I had, and this is it's nice I get paid to be in beautiful places like this. But if you have any questions, hopefully I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to have a little time for questions at the end.